I'm Cormac Downey. I'm the Arboricultural Officer with the OPW, and we're here today in Kilkenny Castle to demonstrate on how to plant a container grown tree. Today we're going to be planting a sessile oak, which is a native Irish oak. A native tree will have the ability to maintain a lot more biodiversity, but we're really guided by the principle of the right tree in the right place for the right reason. So where we can plant natives, we always strive to do that. We were working here with the staff. They pointed out an area that had the capability of taking an oak tree, which is eventually going to be a very, very large tree. So you have to appreciate when you plant a tree how big it's going to be. But here in Kilkenny there's plenty of scope for an oak tree. Again, we go along the principle of the right tree in the right place. So you would need to know your area, you need to know what type of soil you have. I mean, the sessile oak would prefer free draining soil. It will take partial shade, but it needs light as well. So you need to know, first of all, the tree you're planting, what its requirements are, and you need to suit that to the site. So we're guided by basic principles when planting a tree. You need, first of all, a good specimen. You need to prepare the planting pit properly. You need to plant the tree correctly, and then you need afterwards to look after it. And that's actually the easiest, that's the nicest part. Today we agreed on the location, so the first thing we needed to do was to dig the planting pit. So we marked the centre of the planting pit with a stake. We tied a piece of rope around the stake and to an edging knife with a length of rope equivalent to 2.5 foot or 3/4 of a metre, which would give us a circle with a diameter of 5 foot or 1.5 metres. And we used that knife to cut a circle. The idea of that was to remove the sod, the turf layer, the grass. And the reason for that is the grass is a huge competitor for nutrients and water. So when we plant our tree, we want to give it the best chance possible to establish and for its roots to grow and extend. And for that, we take away the sod layer. So once we have our circle cut and the sod removed, what we do, we mark a cross through the circle, and where the ends of the cross meets the edge of the circle, we mark out a line which creates a square in the middle. What happens is we have 4 corners, and these are weak points where roots are able to break through and extend. Once we have that square marked off, we dig away the square to the depth of the root ball of the tree. The idea being the top of the root ball in the container has to be the same as the top layer of the ground surrounding. That's really, really important. If you get one thing right in all this exercise, is to get the planting depth correct, because so many trees get planted too deep. They either die or they take years and years to establish. So the planting depth is very, very important. Once we dig out the hole, we keep measuring that depth with a long straight piece of timber just to ensure that the depth is correct. And once we have the level right, what we do is make sure that the root ball is well soaked. The tree we're dealing with today, the container is quite large. If we had a smaller container tree, we could put that container into a large bucket of water, and you would leave it in until all the air bubbles stop coming up. Then you know it's fully soaked. But the tree today, we're just going to water it and give it a good soaking because it's too heavy to lift. When you're dealing with big container trees, especially the larger ones, you should always have 2 people helping you and always lift with the handles on the container. Once you give it a good soaking, you take it out of the pot and place it back in the hole, and again check your levels are correct. It's at that stage you're able to assess the condition of the roots and if it's pot bound. And if it's really badly pot bound, which means if the roots are quite large and are starting to circle, then the tree should be returned to where it came from. You shouldn't plant it. But the one here today is good. You can tease those roots out. You're small enough and young enough to do that. You orientate the tree to the way you want it to face. So the majority of people will look at a tree from a certain angle. So you want to make sure that that looks correct. Once that's done, we start to backfill with the soil. Couple of inches depth every time, and then you heel it in an even layer all the time, and then the next layer on top of it, and you continue to do that until you're just to the top layer of the root plates of the tree, and that should be in line with the surrounding ground. You should be able to see the mulch that was in the container originally, and it should be in line with the top of the ground. That's your ideal depth, and that's what you're aiming for. I can't highlight enough how important that planting depth is. So once you have the tree in, we would water the ground again, and in this instance we water the entire pit right out to the edges. One of the reasons for this is we're going to then apply a layer of mulch. The benefits of mulch: it regulates extremes. Your rooting area won't get too hot, it won't get too cold, it won't get too wet, and it won't get too dry. It's because once you remove the sod layer, the bare soil is exposed. So you can imagine that in the middle of a heat wave, that'll dry out much quicker than the surrounding area, which is what we want to avoid. Or if it's very wet, that'll get waterlogged. We have a lovely mulch here today. It's composted organic mulch. It helps condition the soil as well over time. What you want to do is avoid putting mulch on dry ground because it can keep it too dry. So we make sure that the rooting area is well soaked before that mulch is put on. Another advantage to the mulch means that grass cutting equipment are kept away from the base of the tree. I think grass probably is, in one way or another, is the biggest killer of trees, whether it's in competition with water and nutrients, or people coming to cut the grass and trim the grass right up close to the tree. They can strip the bark, wring bark it in a second, and that's the tree gone. So once we've mulched it, we look at staking. You have to decide whether, first of all, it needs to be staked. If it doesn't need to be staked, don't stake it, because people do tend to overstake trees or stake for the sake of it. It's essential actually a tree moves in the wind, because that movement or that flex encourages or stimulates growth down at the bottom of the stem where the stem meets the ground, and that's where you get your root flare, this lovely flare, that lovely picture of a tree that comes up from the ground and up. So the movement is what stimulates that, so we want to encourage that, but we also want to ensure that the tree we have just planted doesn't fall over. The staking will keep that tree in place for a year, 2 years. If it gets over 2 years, there's something wrong. I think after 2 years, maybe 3 years at most, the stake should be removed. If the tree is still moving after that, it's something has gone wrong. The tree here today is quite tall, so we've decided to stake it. And we're going to use a crossbar stake, which is basically 2 posts and a piece of timber across. If we were planting a bare root tree, once you have your planting hole dug out, you could insert the support stake in the hole first, and then put your tree and arrange the roots around the post, so there's no damage to any roots. For container trees, one of the options is this crossbar staking, and the tree with a tree tie and spacer is connected to it. In fact, if you're staking a tree and the stake is connected to the tree itself, you should always use round stakes and not square stakes, because they can rub and cause damage. And also, when you are putting your stake in, have the stake the windward side, so the wind hits the stake first. If it's the other way around, you'll get this movement of the tree hitting against the stake, and that can cause some damage to the bark. And all these trees, the container or bare root, they're all relatively young trees, so the bark is really, really thin and really easily damaged. So you want to try to avoid that. You need to be aware of your site, and you will be aware of any threats like grazing animals. Maybe you have cattle, maybe there's deer, rabbits, hares. Sometimes a tree will need some sort of protection, some sort of fencing off, some spiral guards possibly, so you have to suit your protection to the threat basically. Here there's none, thankfully. We can leave it as it is. Going back to the basic principles of planting a tree, the last one is the aftercare, and it's the one sometimes that's most forgotten. What we need to do, not just plant a tree, but we need to establish trees. The planting part is sort of easy and it's basic enough really, but to ensure that a tree lives and survives, is really what we want to do. So we need to establish trees as opposed to plant them. For aftercare, it should be the best part, because you're able to come out and have a look at your tree and see how it's faring and see how it's progressing, and the buds and the growth. The first 3 years really are crucial, so you want to keep an eye on it. You want to make sure there's no signs of pests and diseases on the tree. You want to make sure buds are flushing at the right time of year, the size of the leaf, colour of the leaf when it does come into leaf. You want to be checking on this tree tie and stake if you have one, and adjust it appropriately if it needs tightening or loosening. In hot weather, you need to ensure, particularly for the first 3 years, that it's well watered. You need to keep the layer of mulch kind of built up. You don't want that to go less than 2 inches. So you're looking ideally to get that 2 to 4 inches in depth. So you want to top that up if need be. After any extreme weather event, have a look. And again, it's the nice part. You're able to walk out, have a look at the tree, and enjoy it. And while you're there, just keep an eye on it. The benefits of trees are massive. They have huge benefit actually in flooding, the obvious wildlife that they support. There is this biophilia hypothesis, which basically means that we have this innate need to connect with nature, and there's no better way to do that than walk around some trees. But it's just that feeling of well-being you get when you walk around a woodland or around trees. I think particularly in spring, when you start seeing them come into leaf, I think it's a very natural thing for people to do. They mightn't realise it, but as I say, it's this innate need for people to connect with nature.